But no, we're appreciative of the fact that you can come back on here because you've got a really interesting background, and I think I'm going to start with the red zone because that's been a phenomenon, and you were in it at the beginning. So I'm just curious kind of the evolution of it, and when you started with the red zone, if you could have foreseen what it's become, because now you have sickos like me that have the quad box on YouTube TV,
yeah.
and then I have red zone as one of the entries on there, and then it goes into the octabox now, and I've got 11 boxes on my screen. I'm not even taking anything in at that point. I'm sitting there eating Nutella on my couch and not taking anything in, and but it's fun while it lasted. It's like as I usually say, it's like snorting football.
Oh, yeah. I think, I started in the original Red Zone. Now, there's two Red Zone channels, or there were two Red Zone channels. The first one was started in 2005, and that was the one that I was a part of. It was the DirecTV version with Andrew Siciliano. And then years later, the NFL Network took on their own Red Zone, the one with Scott Hansen, but they're basically the same show. You're going back and forth through games so everyone can watch. I think when it first started, there was only a couple of us that really, took it off from the beginning. And it was, you around that time, the early 2000s, late 90s is when fantasy football really started to take off. Everybody nowadays has got their own fantasy team. People who don't even know anything about football have got their own fantasy team, and they're drafting. It's become a phenomenon. It's something, it's a water cooler talk thing. It's something everyone's always chatting about or texting about. Who should I start, this or that? And I think that's where Red Zone really, made its impact, because you can watch your one game. I'd never really watched the show as much other than working on it. But like when I was on my days off, like I'm sitting there and I'm watching the entire Lions game. But for those people that really are into fantasy and looking at and wanting to go to all the games and seeing, hey, this guy scored, my guy scored, and that's kind of what what made it take off. And it's almost like it's also really bad for people with attention deficit disorder like myself, because you're going from game to game to game to game. But you can also see how it makes it more interesting for just the overall watch experience of football. So at the time, no, we weren't sure like how it would be, but man, it took off big and it took off fast. And Andrew Siciliano, I don't know if you're familiar with him. I believe he's the voice of the Cleveland Browns now, but he was an NFL Network talent and host here for many years, and he was amazing. He was really good, and we always say that this was the original one, and then the NFL Network ended up replicating it with Scott Hansen, which is what you see now modern day. But the original Red Zone from DirecTV you got with your NFL Sunday Ticket package, I think you had to upgrade to like the premium or something, I believe. And it was really good. People really, really loved it. Andrew was a great host. He was great at segueing in between games, giving you stats, highlights. It lasted for about, I want to say 15, 16, 17, 18 years, somewhere around that part. I stopped working on it in 2020, but then it went for a few more years, so I'm not exactly sure about the number. But it evolved into, we ended up doing a Fantasy Zone channel, which was also part of your upgrading your package on Sunday Ticket, where it was the same kind of show, but it was more focused on fantasy relevance. So it's like, hey, you got 6 points here, or hey, here's the top performers today in standard scoring leagues and stuff, because the fantasy industry is it's a multi-billion-dollar industry nowadays. It is a huge, huge thing, and not just in football. You've got baseball, basketball, hockey. I'll embarrass myself on your show right now, Ryan. I've been doing fantasy hockey for over 25 years. It's big business. I mean, you've got television shows, podcasts, everywhere dedicated to the fantasy aspect of sports, and I think that's Red Zone was one of those things that kind of helped that. The fantasy world kind of evolve for people.
Well, that's a good bona fide for the Flying Octopus podcast, though, that you've been doing it for 25 years. That's a bona fide right there. I've never played fantasy hockey. I'm trying to listen to guys like you and Devin and Tony so that I can understand the Wings more. This is the first season that I've seen all the games in a long time, since they were kind of in their heyday when I was younger. But I've kind of retired from fantasy. It's a little too much for me. I like, because it does change the game. It changes the way you watch things, and Red Zone is, I guess, emblematic of that to a degree, where you and that's more of the cause, I guess, like you said, kind of causation more than correlation to a degree, where you were able to kind of push that fantasy stuff forward because they were seeing all the touchdowns, they were seeing all the teams in the red zone. And I would think the one that you're not mentioning, that now no longer has to be a whispered secret on the broadcast for this stuff because it sponsors everything, is the gambling element to it, because I'm sure that kind of you rode the fantasy wave, and then now it's the gambling wave combined with the fantasy wave, which combined are basically like one of the biggest industries we have.
Yeah, and that's just going down a whole other wormhole of what the industry has become. You know, you'll watch on SportsCenter players suspended for gambling, and then right after they'll say, "Well, this segment was brought to you by DraftKings." It's a different world. It's definitely a different world. I think I'm old enough to have been through all aspects of it. Gambling is it's a slippery slope to go down in the sports industry, as we've seen. Across the board in all sports, whether it's athletes, coaches, whatever, players getting in trouble, point shaving, all that. So I am concerned a little bit about the direction of sports as a whole with the whole gambling, the process moving forward. So it's definitely going to be interesting. But yes, you're definitely correct in saying that gambling has, now that it's become a little more legalized in a lot of states, that it definitely has a huge impact on the way we watch sports today.
Yeah, this is a good show to talk about it in that way, because you're absolutely right. You can't really talk about it objectively in podcasts and TV shows, whatever, the sporting events. They're all sponsored by that. There's a lot of podcasts that try to talk about gambling, and then they say, "Oh, brought to you by DraftKings or FanDuel," and you can't talk about it properly. One of the only segments we've done on gambling was a friend of mine that is basically a legal expert that helped in bringing sports gambling to Michigan. He was an advisor on how to actually get the legalities down. And I brought him on and had a very in-depth conversation about how all this stuff works in the different states and the possible pitfalls with it. So we're not going to get sponsored by DraftKings anytime soon. And I wouldn't accept the sponsorship anyways. So it's because it can be very dangerous. It can, it does have a lot of harm that's associated with it, with the addiction to it and all of that. And I just like the purity of the game. I like watching the game. I don't want to care if somebody scores the first touchdown or if somebody hits a certain amount of yards, or that's too much for me to manage. I'd just rather watch my teams and then also watch the other games for just the beauty of the game, and not have to have rooting interests that are strange, where I need the tight end to catch 35 yards in that game to get the payout.
Yeah, but I know, and I totally agree with you there, and I'm exactly the same way. But a lot of people aren't.
Oh yeah,
and you have a lot of friends who you're at a party, you're at a dinner, and they're on their phones with FanDuel, and they've got 3-leg parlays, and you can do all that now, and it's almost like it's an addiction. For the people, I know it is an addiction, but it's something like I just don't know how this is going to progress into something that you can say is really going to be good, not only for the sport, but good for, individuals who get into this kind of behavior. It's definitely something dangerous, a dangerous path I think we're going down. And, we could take this into a whole nother wormhole now. When you think about, NIL these days, now college athletes are getting paid. It's a much different world that we live in, even from like 10 to 15 years ago with the way that sports and how they're going about making money nowadays.
But we'll come back with Evan Sabourin and talks more broadcasting and football. Stick with us. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. One that I've been wanting to cover for a while, and I think Evan is a good candidate to do this. I've been trying to kind of tell people, especially since we have a more local show. This one is a little bit more expanded now that we have Shayne on there, and we try to cover more football topics because he's got such an expansive knowledge base and he's got connections all around the league and all that. But we're still Michigan based, and we try to emphasize, like, hey, we bring guys on like Evan and Tony Wolak and Devin Little, and we bring people on that actually cover the local stuff, because as soon as you start going to the national scene, you're going to get into things that are aggregated and just farmed for engagement. And you kind of made a reference to that for the national shows. Although I will say that the national shows that you worked on in the Dan Patrick Show and the Rich Eisen Show, they're much more focused. They seem to be less like that. I'm thinking more Colin Cowherd with things like that. But with Eisen and Patrick, they're more interview based and they're more thoughtful, at least. But I'm curious about your experience on both of those shows and just in the industry in general.
Yeah, like I said, man, the industry is always changing, and we're getting into a different aspect. We're going into a new era of the industry, especially when you start thinking about with what AI can do nowadays. But the Dan Patrick Show was running for about 6 or 7 years as a radio show before DirecTV picked it up in 2009 to broadcast it. And that was one of the first shows that you actually saw that kind of went with that business model. And nowadays you see everything there. You see the Pat McAfee Show, the Rich Eisen Show evolved through the Dan Patrick Show at DirecTV on the Audience Network. It's the way we consume our media nowadays. It's different. Now we're midway through the podcast eras too. Everyone's got a podcast now. How many podcasts were out, 10, 15 years ago? Not many. Now, how many podcasts are out today? I think the pandemic contributed a lot to that. But it's a different business model that everyone's adapting, and it's kind of crazy to see how media started. You went from your sports centers, those shows, but now people can consume media from anywhere. I mean, you go on YouTube, how many different shows will you find on there to watch? On our podcast, we put it out on Spotify, iTunes, iHeart, but we also we do. There's a video aspect that you have to put out, and that helps you reach, on all these different platforms to try to engage people. It's about followers and likes and clicks and all that nowadays. Whereas back in the day, when I started in this industry, I started back in 1998 at WXYZ there in Detroit with Don Shayne and Dave Llewellyn. And from where I was then, as a young kid, actually still in college, to where I am now, approaching 50 years old with a family, just the turnover and what you see in the industry, things are different. As I said, the way we consume media, just the different kinds of media. Back when we were younger, it was, hey, I want to get my sports highlights tonight. Well, I'm going to tune into Rich Eisen and Stuart Scott for SportsCenter. And nowadays, I mean, you can go to 100 different places to get your sports information. And now with podcasts, even such as mine, dating on the Red Wings, it's more centralized, more specialized. That I don't need to see what's going on nationally. I want to know what's going on with my Red Wings. So if there's 5 or 6, 7, probably more Red Wings podcasts out there. Detroit Lions. You want to talk about the Detroit Lions? There's just as many, or probably more. And it's just a different business model. And I think part of the way this industry is kind of, I'm not going to say struggling, but I think there's still people are kind of trying to still figure out and navigate their way of what is the business model moving forward for the next decade, because it's continually evolving. There's just always different things that are coming out, shows, tweets, podcasts, whatever, and it's just a different ball game. And it's at my age and, trying to learn to adapt, what's the next best thing or what's the kind of shows that you want to put out there that will gain attention, because there's just so many options now. Anyone can start a podcast. Anyone can start their own YouTube show. That's what the difference is with technology nowadays. It's a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. And that's why it's a good discussion point, especially for a show like ours and a station like ours, our station owners building out a sports lineup. But his whole goal, the model here is very different. It's less focused on, sure, we want listeners and all of that and to provide a good product, but it's not necessarily focused on engagement and that sort of business model that typifies the industry, which is why we can make different shows. That's why my show is different. That's why I always go to the local markets. You mentioned all those podcasts and writers and stuff that are in the local markets. That's why we have a whole Rolodex of guys that cover the Red Wings for us, cover the Lions, cover the Pistons, and highlight their outfits, because what always astounds me is you have a lot of people that listen to your guys' podcast, that read Tony and Devin on the Hockey Writers and do all of that stuff, but they don't even look at the byline. They don't even look at who it is. They don't even know the names. And so that's why we try to feature a lot of those folks on the show, because there's, they like the content and everything, but they should know whose article they're reading. They should know who in the local market is supplying this, because it's not, you can watch the national stuff, like you said, if you want entertainment and get an idea of the national scene and what's trending and all of that'll give you that, and you can listen to the personalities that you like the best. But really, if you want information on the local scene, you have to go to the local folks that are covering it, like you guys and a lot of the other folks that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's oversaturation. I mean, it's definitely what it is. And, some things, some successful podcasters, I don't want to use their names, but who I've talked to about how I build our podcast and how I make it better. And the thing that you have to really do, like, to stand out, and I've been told this from many of these people, is that, you got to figure out what's different. What are you doing that's different from this person or that person? How do you stand out compared to, this podcast or this show? Like I said, the formulas are continually evolving about how you get engagement, because that's, like I said, that's what it's about, is engagement, clicks, likes. That's what's, this is what you're doing it for. If you're doing it to get sponsorship, because, setting up a podcast or doing a show on YouTube or whatever, like, it's not cheap. There is financial obligations to kind of put a good product out there. So it's trying to differentiate and trying to do something that other people aren't doing. But again, there's so many people doing it. The competition, it's cutthroat, because there's just so many people. Everybody wants to talk sports. Everybody wants to have their own show, whether it's sports or fitness or modeling or talk shows. Everybody wants to do that. And like I said earlier, with the way technology is going today, anyone can do that if they want to. And that's where I think you're going to get just oversaturated in the market, not just in sports, but in any kind of talk show format or what I'm talking about. But it's getting crazy. It's getting crazy, and it's a very difficult thing to do. When we started putting this podcast together, it's I figured, this would be easy. Guys like me and Tony and Devin, we watched the Red Wings our whole lives, know everything about it. But it is a tough business to get into, and it's definitely even a tougher business to find a moderate to really to be really successful.
Exactly. And but I can guarantee, Evan, talk about differentiation, we're the only show that combined kicking analytics with talking about Nutella with every guest. So there you go. There's
Don't forget the mashed potatoes.
Yeah, exactly. That was Monday. So we got something unique for the audience. But no, it's a good conversation to have for sure. And I like that we're informing people on how this stuff works. So really appreciate you coming on. We didn't even cover any Lions this show, by the way. So thankfully there wasn't too much going on this week as far as we covered some of the Petsing stuff and other stuff last week. But we'll definitely have you back on to cover more of that and cover more of this broadcast stuff, because I think this is interesting stuff as kind of an expert in the industry here. So we'll definitely look forward to having you back on both shows. But tell the people where they can follow you for all of this stuff, for the Flying Octopus podcast and all the great stuff that you're doing.
Yeah, you can follow me at Twitter at Sabourin91, Saber91. I don't even know how to say my own name anymore. That's tied to the Flying Octopus podcast. At Flying Octopod is where you can find me, Tony, and Devin. We do a weekly show, putting out a lot of tweets, stats, info, news. You can also follow us on our YouTube channel at The Flying Octopod, where, as I just said, we broadcast as well as we put out the audio format. And again, this is something that we're just very passionate about. And yes, we want it to take off and get likes, but at the end of the day, we're three guys who've followed hockey our whole lives, and we love talking Red Wings hockey and what the future holds. And it's been a pretty exciting season so far with the Red Wings' success up to this point heading into the Olympic break. So give us a listen, man. Yeah, we love talking hockey.